The recent release of the Resident Evil 4 remake now concludes a whole trilogy of Resident Evil remakes. Resident Evil 2 and 4 remakes are, in my opinion, strong in their own ways. However, instead of talking about the good Resident Evil remakes, we're instead going to be talking about the bad one. The Resident Evil 3 remake has a very long list of problems. I could talk about how the game is pathetically short, or the lack of replayability, or how it's inferior to RE2 in practically every way. But out of all of those problems, none of them hold a candle to, at least in my opinion, the most disappointing part about the game: Nemesis. It still baffles me how Capcom was able to screw up a villain this iconic, especially when they already had the perfect template for him in Mr. X. Despite RE2 and RE3 remakes only being 16 months apart, these are two very, very different villains. One is a terrifying and hulking tyrant, while the other is a pathetic shadow of his former self. But why is that? Why did Mr. X work so well, and what made Nemesis such an underwhelming villain? Well, let's talk about it. Let's start off with the introduction of these villains. In Resident Evil 2, Mr. X shows up at around the 2-hour mark with the iconic scene of him lifting the helicopter and making a dash for the player. You start shooting just to realize it's not doing anything, then run back outside in sheer panic. Probably my favorite part about this scene, however, is the fact that it's not a cutscene. Most villains are introduced with cutscenes where you can do nothing but sit back and watch. Not that it's always a bad thing, but with Mr. X, his introduction is that much more memorable because the player is actually playing the game, not just watching it. Another thing that this scene does right is the build-up. In Leon's campaign, when you get to the prison, you get a little teaser at Mr. X when he gruesomely kills Ben, literally dragging him up the wall and crushing his head like a melon. This scene is not only there to intimidate the player, but it gives you a first-hand example of what this creature is capable of, making him that much more intimidating when you do stumble across him. In the Resident Evil 3 remake, Nemesis is introduced in the first 5 minutes with a cutscene of him breaking through the wall of Jill's apartment. This leads to a scene where Jill tries to escape her apartment while being chased by Nemesis. I honestly don't hate this introduction as much as other people, but with that said, this scene obviously has some problems. First off, this is a cutscene as opposed to a gameplay segment, and like I said earlier, I don't think using cutscenes to introduce a villain is lazy or bad, but I do enjoy Mr. X's introductions more for the reasons I already listed. The opening segment in Jill's apartment technically has gameplay involved, but said gameplay is restricted to running down a fire escape and then running down a hallway, not to mention that holding up on the analog stick barely passes as a gameplay segment. Another problem that this scene has is that there is no tension or build-up at all. As I said earlier, before Mr. X is introduced, you watch him brutally murder someone right in front of you, which is of course a common and great way to introduce a villain. Nemesis does not have a scene like that. In fact, Nemesis kills almost nobody throughout this game aside from the faceless guys in the helicopter and the civvies on the train. Why not just have a scene early on where Brad gets absolutely fucked up by Nemesis, just like, oh, I don't know, the original? But no. Brad is instead killed by random zombies, and Nemesis, the bioweapon specifically designed to kill STARS members, ends up not killing a single member of STARS. So that concludes the introduction for these villains, but admittedly it is a small factor when considering their overall quality. A big factor, however, is how the player fights these villains in gameplay, so who has the edge in this category? Mr. X and Nemesis behave very similarly, with few but very key differences. First of all, Mr. X is limited to a power walk when chasing you. His attacks knock you flat on your ass, and he's completely unkillable. Probably the best thing about Mr. X, however, is his unpredictability. Some of my most memorable moments in RE2 were me casually walking through the RPD just to turn the corner and see Mr. X making a beeline right for me. Or I'll be in the safe room organizing my inventory and being very hesitant on leaving because of the very loud footsteps right outside the door. Exploring the RPD knowing that Mr. X can literally be anywhere adds a lot to the experience. Mr. X's intimidation factor becomes very apparent when you start walking to your objectives and actively evading zombies so you don't make any noise. Now with all that said, Mr. X, of course, is not without some flaws. The most notable problem I can think of is Mr. X spending a prolonged period of time waiting directly outside the safe room door, which then leaves you with the choice of making a run for it or waiting for him to eventually leave. If you're playing on higher difficulties, then you almost always want to stay and wait for him to leave, which often screeches the gameplay to a halt. It is a very minor problem, but it is still there. In the Resident Evil 3 remake, Nemesis at first seems a lot more intimidating. Unlike Mr. X, Nemesis is much more mobile. He can literally drop out of the sky and chase Jill in a full-on sprint, which I must say is quite horrifying. Upon first impression, Nemesis looks like Mr. X but tuned up a few notches, and at first that's what I thought too, but when you look a little deeper, the problems become a lot more obvious. Problem number 1, Nemesis, despite being a near indestructible bioweapon, can be temporarily stunned by a single frag grenade. When your villain gets one-shotted by a single and easily attainable item, then you're probably doing something wrong. Problem number 2, Nemesis cannot enter certain rooms, so when you're running away with Nemesis in hot pursuit, you can quickly duck into one of these rooms for safety. And this is especially amusing at the toy shop, where Nemesis will literally sit and stare at you through the window. Now, as I said earlier, Mr. X also has this exact problem. The difference is, and I know I'm not alone on this, why can't Nemesis enter safe rooms? Nemesis was supposed to be Mr. X just tuned up a few notches, right? Wouldn't it be way scarier if there was truly no safe haven from Nemesis? Or better yet, why not have Nemesis enter safe rooms when playing at max difficulty? Sure, it might sound extreme at first, but I truly think that this would have made Nemesis a much more intimidating boss. It fixes the issue of safe room standoffs and gives Nemesis a leg up on Mr. X in terms of scare factor, but alas, it never came to be. And the last and most insulting problem with Nemesis is that almost every single segment involving Nemesis post the 1 hour mark is a scripted boss fight. And it should be said that these boss fights aren't exactly great. I did enjoy the first fight on top of the roof. I think that's the best fight in the game easily, but the rest of the boss fights are okay at best. Also, this is a total nitpick, but it's something that really bothered me. Nemesis has Jill dead to rights well over 5 to 6 times throughout this game, and instead of killing her, he just throws her to the side, giving her time to escape, or just blatantly ignores her. And yes, plot armor is in every video game ever, however some games mask it way better than others, and when it happens over and over again, it just starts to get funny. The fact that Nemesis is so genuinely horrible at the one thing that he was built to do. The more I talk about it, the more I realize that the majority of the problems with Nemesis mostly stem from the problems with RE3 as a whole. The extremely linear structure of the story and gameplay segments I think hurt Nemesis a lot. Meanwhile, Mr. X's potential is maximized by the design of the RPD. Not to mention that, while Mr. X does have some scripted segments, it pales in comparison to Nemesis, where a majority of his encounters with the player are scripted. I think that about wraps up all my thoughts, and with them all laid out, I've come to a simple conclusion. The Nemesis and Resident Evil 3 remake as a whole is one of the biggest wastes of an opportunity I've ever seen in my life, especially when directly compared to RE2. Instead of exploring and backtracking throughout Raccoon City, we're instead forced into an extremely railroaded third-person shooter that's less than 5 hours long. And yes, I'm very well aware that the original RE3 is a very short game as well, but that's why it's called a Resident Evil 3 remake, not remaster. And while it sucks that the RE3 remake wasn't as good as it could have been, nobody gets hurt from this more than Nemesis. A villain this iconic deserves so much better. Also, before I sign off here, just a quick question. Does anybody want an RE5 remake? Because I definitely fucking don't.